The Shroud of Turin, an overview and analysis of evidence. What is the Shroud of Turin? In simple terms, the Shroud of Turin is a long cloth that shows an image of a crucified man. Many believe it may be the cloth that was used to wrap and bury Jesus Christ. This artifact has sparked debates for years in the scientific and religious communities as people tried to prove and disprove the theory that this really was the cloth that was used to wrap Jesus. There have been many tests on the shroud, and some have conflicting evidence, which only fuels the debates and drives scientists into further questions. But before we get into everything that's happening today, let's go back to the first records of the Shroud of Turin. Origin and history. The Shroud of Turin first appeared in Liry, France in the 1350s. It is said that a knight by the name of Geoffrey de Charny presented the shroud to the dean of the Church of Liry. It is also believed that the shroud was presented as a burial cloth of Jesus Christ. However, the fact that we have no knowledge of the shroud before the 1300s, and the fact that we have no record of how this knight came to possess it, makes this claim questionable. The shroud was displayed in the Church of Liry for some time, and even then, debates were sparked on its authenticity. In 1389, Pope Clement VII declared that the shroud was not the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. He had received word from Pierre d'Arcis, the Bishop of Troyes, France, that an artist had forged the shroud and admitted to it. The bishop also claimed that the dean of Liry knew this, but displayed it anyway. After this declaration, the church continued to display the shroud, but started saying that it was an icon rather than a historic relic. In other words, it started claiming that this was simply a painting rather than the actual cloth used to bury Jesus. In 1488, Geoffroy de Charny's granddaughter and husband took the shroud into their castle to protect it during the 100 Years' War. They acknowledged it was not the shroud and stored it for many years. However, when the time came to return the shroud, they refused. Margaret de Charny took the shroud on a tour advertising it as the burial cloth of Jesus. She later sold the shroud to the royal house of Savoy in exchange for 2 castles. This caused her to be excommunicated from the church. The House of Savoy moved the shroud to Sainte-Chapelle in Chambry, and in 1502 a fire broke out in the building. The case that the shroud was stored in was melted, and a piece of hot metal burned through the shroud, and these marks can still be seen today. In 1578, the shroud was moved to the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, and it remains there today. Throughout the years, there have been many studies on the shroud, but arguably the most famous was the 1988 radiocarbon dating. In 1988, a corner of the shroud was removed and sent to 3 places: the University of Arizona in Tucson, the Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, and the University of Oxford. After sampling and testing this piece, the conclusion came to be that the shroud originated between 1250 and 1350. Since this matched with the evidence of a forgery from medieval times, many thought that this would be the final blow to those claiming the shroud was authentic. However, there were many problems with the test that caused some to question its accuracy. The first problem with this test was that the sample only came from one corner of the shroud, and this makes the test less accurate since parts of the shroud would have been affected by many different things over the years. Not only that, it is believed that this corner had been affected by the Chambry fire, and if this is true, it would have affected the carbon content and caused the test to be inaccurate. It is also believed that the sisters in Chambry repaired the cloth after it had been damaged. In 1998, Dr. Ray Rogers questioned the authenticity of the carbon dating, so he performed many thermochemical tests on the same area. The thing he found disproved the carbon dating test. One of the main things he found was that there was evidence of cotton content and cloth dye in that area that was tested. And this would match the claims that the nuns in Chambry had repaired the cloth after the fire. His other tests also showed more evidence that this piece was not part of the original linen used to create the shroud, but was rather a later addition. There have also been less famous studies on pollen content, DNA, and dust on the shroud. They've really all come back with different findings, some saying that the shroud originated in Jesus' time, and some saying that they originated in the medieval times. And really all that comes back, and it just makes the shroud continue to remain in question. But the studies aren't the only thing on the shroud that cause it to be question-provoking. Shroud of Turin has a lot of very interesting features. As stated previously, it shows the image of a man who is crucified and scourged. However, the formation of this image has been a debate across time. For many years, it was believed that if this was a forgery, it was simply paint or some kind of thing used to paint this image onto the shroud. Or if it was authentic, it may have been bloodstains, sweat, things that would leave a mark. In 1898, S. Pia conducted the first scientific study on the shroud, and after taking a photo negative of the shroud, he realized that the image was actually a photo negative itself. Another study in 1978 was conducted by the STIRT team. The STIRT team was a group of scientists that conducted multiple studies on the shroud throughout a couple of years, and they confirmed that the image did not come from a painting. They found that there was no evidence of paint strokes, and there was no evidence of inorganic pigments that would have been used as paints. However, there were other studies that showed evidence that a medieval painter could have used red ochre, which contains iron, and iron was something that was found during the STIRT studies. The question of if this is just an impressive forgery still remains, but if it was not a forgery, how could it have even been formed? One theory behind the shroud is that it could have been created by an extreme amount of UV light radiation. This would have allowed for the photo negative to be created without burning the shroud, but something like this would be unexplainable. Many understand that when something in archaeology cannot be explained, it is often said it has to be with religion or the supernatural. But this idea of a great light does relate to things that we know about Jesus. In Matthew 17, it states, "There he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light." While many are not Christian or believe in the supernatural, it does show that if the Bible is true and if Jesus really was God, then something like a great light would be plausible. Again, that verse was Matthew 17:2. In all, an important thing to remember is that the origin of the shroud is extremely questionable. The fact that 1,300 years had passed since the time that Jesus had died and the time that the shroud came into the public eye already makes the claim that this was his burial cloth questionable. Something like the burial cloth of Christ would be something sought after by many Christians during that time. And since we have no records of it being in public, it really just makes you want to question if this is authentic. Another thing to think about is the controversial studies. Since this is such a controversial piece, we will most likely always have someone trying to dispute the evidence or even want things to go a certain way. If one is looking for a certain outcome, it's usually more likely that they'll find it that way. Shroud's features remain as arguably the most controversial part of this topic. Since the question of where this cloth came from and when it actually came into existence are questionable, the shroud's features also kind of become questionable. And really, in all, it's possible that this shroud could be one of two things. The first is a forgery. There's evidence that the shroud could have been created in medieval times, but The level of skill and craftsmanship would have to be perfect. It would be extremely hard for someone in this time to create such a detailed image without leaving any brushstrokes. The other theory is that this is authentic. The image on this cloth could have been due to a supernatural release of ultraviolet light, similar to that in the Transfiguration of Jesus. In all, it will be hard to completely determine the truth of the Shroud of Turin. The fact that this cloth has been in multiple fires, in the possession of many different people, and has no record for over 1,000 years makes things very questionable. Also, every study on the Shroud is going to be constantly questioned. Both sides of this piece are extremely biased. Believers will want to find evidence that can only be explained supernaturally and prove the authenticity, and non-believers will want to find evidence that this is a forgery or evidence that it was not created until a later date. But no matter the amount of evidence or studies completed on the Shroud, it will likely remain as one of the most controversial artifacts today. If you'd like more information or want some information on where I found this content, these are some great places to look. Thank you for watching.